Is at Clemson University. As you can see, she's Senior Director of University Development. And she came and spoke to our board, and we're so grateful for that and for her insight. Missy is working for AFP International as a volunteer, and she can share some of that insight with you. And we will end at 1:25. So let's give a round of applause for our guest speaker, Ms.
Today, which is I've never spoken off an iPad with my notes, so if I stumble, please let me know, but I really would like to get to that point of electronics. I feel like I'm drowning in paper. So, you know, when Annie called me, it was really funny. She said, well, would you come speak? And of course I said, Annie, if you'll come down here. So we are doing a swap because she's going to come down to us in the upstate chapter. But it was interesting. She asked me what topic might you speak on, and I said, well, I have this kind of favorite that I do with AFP chapters because I think a lot of us, you know, this tends not to be the university world. You're working a lot with executive directors and boards, and so a couple years ago, the AFP chapter in New Orleans asked my former boss and I to come speak. He was the dean of the business school at Clemson, and that is how I came to Clemson. He hired me away from Atlanta, and I came up, and we got this call from the AFP chapter asking us to keynote their conference and to come down and talk about this great relationship we had between me as the development officer and he essentially as the CEO. And the funny thing about that call that day was I literally had just hung up the phone, hollering in the phone at him about something, my dean, got off the phone, picked up the other phone because this chapter was calling, and they said, you know, this great relationship, and I called the dean back. His name was Claude. I called Claude back and I said, you're not going to believe this. They think we have a really healthy relationship here. Little do we know, little do they really know. So Claude and I actually sometimes do this presentation together, which is, I'm sad that, you know, he's now the president of Presbyterian College, which means he's way more important, and his time is not as free. But we wrote this presentation together, and what we started down that conversation, you know, it was about 4 years into our working relationship, and in that 4.5, 5 years, I guess, we had raised over $20 million for Clemson University together. We had launched into the silent phase of a $50 million capital campaign, while the university was in a $600 million campaign. But actually what we were probably most proud of was that we had engaged back so many alums back into our organization. You know, yes, of course, the big numbers, the millions, that's great. But our annual donors spiked over those 5 years to the college. And what we kind of talked about as we were putting this presentation together is we both walked into this relationship kind of believing a lot of what I would say are myths about working together as a CEO and a DO. And so that's what we entitled this presentation, was Debunking the Myths, because there are a lot of myths out there about that relationship and how to work it through. And I think both Claude and I agree we're not experts in this by any means. I think probably everybody in this room has had as good of stories as I will share today, or even better stories. We just wanted to share in the presentation kind of what I would call our aha moments in that relationship as we grew. And to this day, I tell him I think it's going to be very hard for me to ever work with another CEO or president, right? In my job, I work with the president, but I still will never have that relationship I had with him, which I think really mimics and mirrors more of what most nonprofits, that relationship between a development officer and a CEO. So let's jump into the myth. And the first thing I always say is, what is a myth? What is a myth?
Something you believe that's not necessarily true.
Exactly. So I think there are actually, this is probably one of the biggest problems in our industry, right? That we as development officers believe one thing, and our boards and our CEOs have a little bit different interpretation of that situation. So it's an imaginary or fictitious person or thing or belief that we have. So today I'm going to share 7 myths that we came up with, and we really kind of, what we did was as we talked through all those things that we kind of learned along the way, we began to put them into 7 big groups or areas. And so I'm going to talk about the myth, and then I'm going to talk about how we came to understand that myth or what we kind of learned along the way. And by no means did we walk into our relationship, as I would say, this healthy. I think along the way we just have learned a lot and kind of come to understand our relationship. So the first myth is that it's going to be, right, working with your CEO and your development officer, a bed of roses, right? Like this is going to be wonderful. But as I joke, does anybody know what this picture is? It's a very famous painting. It's the War of the Roses. And I think that is really more of what it's about. And I tell people this all the time. Claude and I fought a lot. And then not in a bad way, but we disagreed on a lot of things. And so I want to kind of take you back to my bed of roses, War of Roses situation, right? And so when Claude recruited me to come to Clemson, I was living in Atlanta. I was looking at a position at Georgia State that they had been recruiting me for a year. You know, the state system can work a little slow, whatever state you're in. And so Claude came along, and he was brand new dean of the business school, and he came, and I sat down with him, and I was at almost signing the paperwork with Georgia State, and Claude came along, and in 45 minutes on a Friday afternoon, shifted my whole world. You know, 6 weeks later, I was living in a place called Clemson, South Carolina, temporarily, that I didn't even know existed. I didn't even know there was Clemson, South Carolina. I'm not obviously a big football person, as you can tell. And the reason I was there was, what I have learned is, it's about working for a visionary. And Claude was a visionary. He had a vision, and I have learned, I don't know if it was luck at the time, I don't know that I was this enlightened at that moment, but it is much easier to work with somebody who is a visionary and excited about raising money, and it's easier, stressful, but easier to also not have to kind of be prodding people out the door. Or lots of times I find development sometimes drives the vision. And I think that, you know, that was my first thing. So here I arrived on campus, right, all naive. I believed I had just found the perfect job and the perfect CEO to work for. And in those first few months were probably some of the hardest few months of my career, because what I realized was I'm very stubborn and Claude was very stubborn. And so we were opinionated and we were stubborn and we disagreed a lot. And those disagreements, you know, we realized that there's really no perfect relationship, and it is a relationship, and you got to kind of work through it. And through those disagreements, we really kind of found our way to work. Like, I don't think everybody's going to work like Claude and I worked. I think you've got to find your way. And that, I think, was the most important thing. Like, we agreed to fight, and we agreed, but when we walked out of the room, right, we didn't take anything personally. Claude had this vision of what being a fundraiser was, and I had a vision of what I thought being a fundraiser was for him, and we kind of had to get to that point where we both understood. So here's what we kind of learned about this too. It's a lot about the personalities, right? Claude loved to call me every day. Sometimes 2 times a day, sometimes 3 times a day, 11 o'clock at night, 7 in the morning, Sundays, Fridays, Thursdays, noon. And you know, I was coming from a world where if you called someone at those hours, we were in crisis mode, right? He wasn't in crisis mode, he just wanted to talk. He wanted to talk. He wanted to talk about new prospects he met at dinner or some fundraising plan or some idea he had. Especially when he got in that car by himself, he liked to call. And he will tell you this. And I think then on his side, you know, I had to come to the realization, like, this is not crisis mode. I should be honored that he looks at me and wants to communicate with me. And I think on his side, he always said he hired me because I would always give my opinion, but I don't think he realized how much I was going to give my opinion. And so, you know, I wasn't shy about sharing that. And so kind of those things both annoyed us, but it was something we needed to understand. It was something about going to work for Claude Lilly that I accepted, right? I can't tell you my new job, my new boss doesn't call me at 11 o'clock at night, and I miss Claude, but Lord, it's nice to go to bed and not worry about Claude calling. And you know, we just did talk on Monday night, so he still does call, but I think, you know, our golden rule as we kind of came up was that we could disagree about anything, but we never disagreed in public. We were a united front, and I think that, I'll never forget this time, one of our first few months together, we were having one of our first cabinet meetings with our volunteers. And I was like, this is my job to come up with the agenda. And he said, I don't think so, this is my job. And so we were arguing about one agenda point for days and days. And as it kept going, we both got even more probably ridiculous. And I can't even tell you today what that agenda item we were fighting about was. But I'll never forget, we had to go make a solicitation on a volunteer. And so when we met in the parking lot, we were discussing and arguing this event. We got into the car and we argued it all the way to the office of this donor. We got out of the car all the way into the building, in the elevator, and the little thing I'll never forget, because we were arguing, the 22nd floor hits, that little bing hits, and we walked out the door, and we were just so happy, and we just loved each other so much so, and the reason why it always sticks out in my head is the donor actually said to us, wow, it must be so nice to have such a great working relationship between you two. And I was like, wow, we really have them full. But I think that's the point, is that these relationships are not always going to be easy. I think that you've got to make sure when you look at going to work for an executive director or CEO, or you are the executive director and CEO and looking to hire a development person, you don't want a yes person. In either case, right? I didn't need a CEO who always agreed with me, and he didn't need a development officer who always agreed with him. So we disagreed a lot. And it didn't get any better. I'm not going to say like we stopped fighting after a couple years. I mean, 4 months before I left my role, we were fighting about the transition of my role, right? We had picked my placement. We could not come to agreement. I thought it should be someone. He thought it should be someone. This is how we thought we should do it. We went to Florida. We had to spend 3 days together. You know, he was already a little upset with me that I was leaving him, but he was more upset that we were fighting over the transition. We went to Florida. We drove from Tampa to Fort Myers in a car together. Fought all the way to there. Got out of the car, talked to the donor. Happy, loved Clemson, so happy. Got back in. Do y'all know Alligator Alley? Have you ever heard of Alligator Alley? Yeah, it's a little desolate. No one's out there. We got in the car and I said, we cannot continue this conversation. And so we listened to a book on tape. I can't remember what book, but we did not talk for 3 hours all the way to Miami. But I think that that's healthy. Like, we accepted this about each other. We accepted that this is who we are and that it's okay that we're going to have these fights. So, you know, when we were writing this presentation, we came up with 4 rules. We kind of called it the guiding rules of our relationship. And we didn't have them formalized when we were going through this, but now that we're out of it, we can really talk about it, which I would encourage if you're going through the process of being hired or hiring someone in either of those positions, you sit down and you talk about what are some of these golden kind of guiding principles that you're going to work with your relationship. I know it sounds corny and kumbaya, but I really think it begins to set the precedent for what your relationship is. So this was the first one. When it came to vision or academics of the college, Claude is in charge. That's not my job. He is the visionary. Academics are his job. If I could give my opinion all day long, but he is in charge of that portion. Now, the second part of this guiding principle, though, is when it comes to marketing and development, I'm in charge. So, we're going to argue it. You don't have to agree with every one of my plans, but if we can't come to an agreement, at the end of the day, he hired me to be the development professional. I'm the one with the development experience, and therefore, I make the decisions on that. And I think that's really, really key. I didn't care how he ran the college, but I did care about, you know, that if I disagreed with him on something around development, that he would let my opinion move forward. And I think having that conversation before you begin actually can help save the problems later in the dialogue. And I think it's about being respectful. This is your, you're the visionary, you're the CEO, but understand when it comes to development, I'm going to need you to trust me. You can tell me what your concerns are, but this is my plan. This is my program. This is what you're paying me to do. Number 3 was, and I'm very big with this with development officers, I see this a lot of times, is that my job as the CEO, or my job as the DO was to make Claude and the vision of the college look good. That was my whole job. Donors love Missy, right? We have fun together. She talks about great programs, but it's not about me. At the end of the day, they want to see the CEO, and I never lost sight of that. Like, I am just the facilitator, and I'm going to say this a lot, but I am just the facilitator of the relationship. At the end of the day, they're going to make an investment in your organization because of the vision or the passion or the direction that is being set by the CEO and the executive director. So I think that's really important to remember. I think sometimes we begin to think in development that it's all about us, right? It's all about us. I mean, I've had moments about that. Oh, that gift was all about me, and then I sit back and I'm like, no, it wasn't. That gift was because I'm a good facilitator. I found a donor who has a passion and connected them back to a program that I love, and they loved, and they thought was great, and they loved the leadership, and they gave that gift. And number 4, and I think this is the most important one, no one, and I mean no one, ever knew when Claude and I disagreed on something. I mean, that office door would close and we would argue, but to the rest of the community, we were a completely united front. And I think that's really, really important. I mean, I see a lot of times we're social people, we like to tell what's going on, but our CEOs and our executive directors, if we disagree with them, then we need to leave. If they're not going to change, then we need to leave. But it's not about taking down an organization or talking about what's going on the office. So.
Can I ask you now, or do I need to wait?
Oh yeah, no, I'm very informal.
You're number 2. This is a very unique relationship you're describing. But if Claude absolutely thought the college was in dire trouble with your plan about something, he would overrule you.
He would fire me, right? That's what I always tell him.
He would overrule your opinion.
Right. No, I told him that's when you need to let me go.
Okay, so you said when you felt strongly enough that you said, if I feel strongly enough to disagree with you about a development matter, a marketing matter, for this school, then you will let me go at that point if you disagree.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to, we might disagree on where we have a party or something like that. But like
say we need another 6 months.
I went to a campaign where the only person who, it's not the next day and be like, I'm done, But I do think that it is, I look at that's my expertise. And I'm going to try really hard. And you know what my favorite thing to do when Claude didn't agree with me is hire a consultant. I hired a consultant to come in, right? I knew I was right, but I hired a consultant to come in because they were the facilitator or the moderator to help him get to the point of which
part of number 2 is you having the confidence to know that if it ever came to that point, that you would happily go somewhere else, start over, and not be worried about keeping your job just to keep your job.
Never.
Okay.
And I think why do we stay in jobs that we're not happy? I mean, I just mean that in a general sense. I see a lot of development officers who get so frustrated with family season, right? That's a big one in our world. People who just can't retire on us. And I think so leave. Like, you're talented, you're a good development officer. There are way more jobs in development than there are development professionals. So why wake up every day not liking what you're doing? That's my personal opinion. There might be others in the room who think differently, but yes, that was my agreement with Claude. Let me go. Let me move on. That's when I will. And we almost came to one time. One time I almost did leave. Okay, so myth number 2, right? If you hire a development officer, you can cross fundraising off your list, right? This becomes their life. Just hanging out. Might even be here. It just looks like it. And I think this is one of the realities. Like, I think what happened to Claude's life when he hired me was more this. So Claude, and still to this day, tells people that I was the largest PETA. His pain in the you-know-what. Because my job was to make sure he was at the right events, tell him what to say at the events, remind him about the donors' babies. I mean, that was my job. Let me tell you about football in the fall at Clemson. It's big, right? This is all we do. And so Claude was running a college. He was running a college all day, all night. But on Friday afternoon in football season, we have our major donors converge on us like you've never seen. What a gift, I think. Like, most organizations have to go to their donors. Our donors come to us 6 or 7 times a year. But we took football very seriously. So if you saw Claude on game day, he would look like he was having a great time and he was just out enjoying it. But inside Claude's pocket were 8 cards. Those 8 cards, 7 of them were the individuals that were most important in that day. Each of those cards had, and I would be happy to ever share them if anybody wants a copy, we can send them because they could be applied to any event, not just football. But we would sit on Monday and we would look at who was coming in for the football game, who was going to be in suites, who were going to be in the president's box, who we knew were in the West End zone, who did we know that was coming in special, maybe from California or New York that we needed to focus on. And we would narrow that pool down to 7 people. Each person had a goal for the weekend. What was the goal of Claude's interaction with that person that weekend? Did we need to move a gift along? Did we need to have a conversation about a gift? Did we need to think about the gift? I can tell you every one of those goals drove around some aspect of the gift. And on that card was the spouse's wife, the children's names, their total giving to Clemson, their last gift date, the last action someone had with them, and then kind of like 2 or 3 sentences about them. I mean, this card was, it fit into his jacket pocket. And then the 8th card listed all the individuals who might be on campus he might run into as he made his way through the game. So on a football day, it looked like Claude was just out having a wonderful, joyous, Saturday afternoon of football. But Monday afternoon, our staff sat and narrowed it down. By Wednesday afternoon, those cards were made. By Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, we were in his office going through each person in the card, what it was, and we had an extra set of cards made for his wife. So the wife got a set of cards on Friday night. They would show up, and what would look like Claude was just meandering through the crowd, seeing people, was pass-offs throughout the entire day. So I would take him, and my job might be these 3 people, and I would move him. Sometimes, I don't know if this happens to your executive directors, but you get that person that loves to talk and talk and talk and talk, and you know that $1 million donor over there is just sitting there and we need to get to him. My job was to be the handler, right? I came in, I said, Claude, oh, it's so great to see you. We need to move him along. We moved him along. I would pass to my other development officer who would take him. So we told him what to say, when to say it, who to say, and moved him through. And I don't think it's a lack of genuineness. Claude was actually very engaged in every person, but that's not his job to remember. Remember that they had a grandbaby yesterday, or remember that they got married last year, or remember that, they were honored by our Beta Gamma Sigma. It was our job to get that information to him. So that was kind of my job, right? To make sure Claude looked really good externally. And to move forward kind of those goals we had around certain individuals and foundations and corporations. But then I would say, in return, Claude did something for us. And the same thing about making fundraising is, the first thing is Claude made me part of his leadership team. So I think that's really, really key. In a college, we had 9 departments, so 9 department chairs and 2 associate deans. And do you know, it was Claude, myself, and the 2 associate deans. So anything that was happening within the college, I was sitting at the ground floor of, being able to say, here's how the market or the donors will react to this, or the community will react. Plus, I was well briefed on what was going on. What did this do? It gave the extension, like the impression that I was the extension of him. To our donors, to the community, if Missy Ryan showed up, it was kind of important too, because Missy's Claude's right hand. And I was kind of his chief of staff, it appeared, like externally. I couldn't tell you anything about accreditation, how many students, classes, but externally my job was to make sure he looked good, the college looked good, and our team and our alums were happy. Like that was my job. So I actually think executive directors need to understand when you get a development officer, if your life doesn't speed up, then maybe it's not the best development officer for you. And don't think fundraising's off the list. It just means somebody's going to wake up and think about that and position the organization every day. All right, so myth number 3. I am the chief development officer. So, we'll get to myth in a minute. Myth 3. I think the reality is for our executives and our CEOs, they are the chief development officer. Claude was our chief. Yes.
Okay, but you know, in Mom and Pop Shop, they don't want to be the chief development officer. The board members don't want to ask anyone for money. So this is actually not a myth. For some of us, this is actually the truth. I mean, they really want to dump. I mean, I know where you're coming from, but they want to dump. And thank God you're here. You've saved us. I never have to make another ask again. Right?
But you know what? Here's the interesting thing, though. Fine. It's about understanding your executive, right? And understanding your volunteers. So I had a board member, when I recruited him in Connecticut, he told me, I will never ask for money, Missy. If you want me on this board, I'm never going to ask for money. I said, Mark, that's quite all right. You come along, you do that. Because what I know is it's not, the ask is one piece of it. So if Mark picked up the phone and thanked someone for a gift, if Mark, I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think we need to understand what people's strengths were. And what his strength was, is he's kind of this like guru in the hedge fund world. And he's got a PhD from Harvard and a PhD from Clemson, but worked at Harvard, worked at Chicago, right? So there was a sect of people where he was just God. Fine. Every one of those people, Mark's going to call and just say, hi, I'm involved. But I will tell you, along the way, 4 years later, he is asking for money. Because I think there's this myth. The myth is, it's scary to ask for money. And once somebody becomes passionate, I don't care how or what, if you say you're never going to fundraise, if you're passionate about something, you ask people for money. You ask people to engage, you ask them to step up. But I think it's about looking at the whole of process of closing a gift, because really that one meeting, if you've done everything else right, that meeting's going to go the way you want it. It's really about understanding your volunteers and what are their strengths. I mean, I have very different volunteers, and I understand each of their strengths, and I use the strengths that they have to be successful. And I think, but what I think it's a good conversation to have when you're looking at being hired by an organization, right? Making the understanding going into it that I'm just the facilitator. You're going to need to stand up, you're going to need to come to meetings, you're going to need to talk. Fine, you don't want to ask? I don't mind asking at all. But I'm going to need you to show up. I'm going to need you to thank people. I'm going to need you to engage with people. And I think that's part of the problem. We accept these jobs without having these dialogues about what this relationship is going to be. So, I don't know that we can change where we are today, but maybe it's part of a dialogue and a conversation. If you have an executive director, what are their strengths? How do you plug their strengths into it? You came to work for them for some reason. I mean, if they were horrible, you wouldn't be working for them. You might find out now they're horrible, but the reality is they all have strengths. They're leading organizations. Why are they there? And capitalize on what they're strong with. So, does that help at all? Okay, so myth 4, which is my favorite myth. How many people in here have had the statement, Bill Gates would be perfect for this? Yes, oh yes. And in Claude and I's world, it's about expectations. Bill Gates represents to me expectations of a board or an executive director and the development officer. So, what I had to learn was, that training of people, that just because Bill has money doesn't mean that they're going Bill's gonna give to us. And if you actually talk to Claude, anytime Claude talked with someone where he thought there was a big bank account, they were the best prospect for us that moment. Best prospect. I probably got a call at 11 o'clock at night. Met so-and-so, they love us, they're gonna give this gift, I know, we need to ask them for money. And so I learned over time that to just go in and say, no, Claude, that's not gonna work, didn't actually get me anywhere. So instead of being the no girl, I became the, that is fantastic news. So tell me a little bit more. And my first question, and he jokes now because he knew I started taking him on this little journey with prospects, but I said, well, tell me all that you think is like what makes this prospect such a good prospect for us, right? I mean, we had 33,000 alums and he's off here fishing for an executive who doesn't really care about Clemson. I think we should come over here first, but if I said that to him, he would be really upset with me. So I would make him come through, and sometimes he had really good ideas and people did give that I would have initially said, no way. So I do think that there's a give and take in this. The second thing I always talked about was, what does so-and-so or what does Bill Gates fund? Are they philanthropic? Like, that's a key question to answer in the conversation. Just because they have money does not mean they're philanthropic. And I think when you start doing this conversation, it begins to start training people. Oh, okay, wait, people already started coming to me with the, oh, they got money and they give. And then the last thing was, and this was the most important, was, do we have a personal connection? Because we could spend months going up a hill where we have no personal connection. And if we don't have a personal connection, why are we even gonna spend our time? Trying to get to someone like Bill Gates is gonna be really hard. So usually this exercise kind of solved that problem, but I think the other side of it is if the development officer doesn't close a gift from the Bill Gates, right? There's a Bill Gates in every community. That does not mean that they're not a good development officer. And I think that's what our boards need to understand. I mean, that's, just because you hire someone and just because maybe they have a relationship with that donor does not mean that that donor is going to give to this new organization, right? I feel like sometimes people hire us because of what they think we have versus our skills at actually running a development office. And I think that also there was a real understanding between Claude and I that not all of our prospects are going to be successful. I had a couple, some donors are going to say no. I had a couple gave us a lake house, $1.1 million over email, which was crazy. I've been visiting with them. We were playing the dance. They knew. But all of a sudden, one October, he emailed me and said, hey, do y'all want a lake house, Lake Norman? Sure. We'll take it. We'll sell it. We'll get the proceeds from it. But then when I went back to them a year later with the president to ask for another $1 million, right? Because they didn't give us cash. They gave us their home, which they had 4 of. They said no. They said no. Not even $10,000. They said no. So sometimes even people who have given in the past are going to say no. Some donors are going to lead you on. I have a donor up in Charlotte who for an entire year kept telling me he was going to do $1 million, do $1 million, do $1 million. Well, when Claude and I showed up to ask for that $1 million, he got mad at me and hasn't spoken to me since. Needless to say, I passed that relationship over to another development officer. I felt like that might help us still get a gift. And then some donors are going to give for the wrong reasons. We have a lot of donors at Clemson who I would argue make transactional gifts, not transformational gifts, right? Yeah. Better access to tickets and parking and football and the president. And so all of those things, I kind of think it goes back to the 7 phases of philanthropy. Everybody gives for different reasons. But Claude and I had an understanding that if a gift didn't close, it wasn't my fault. It was our problem. We were a team. We celebrated the gifts we closed, and we licked our wounds on, like Keith Eads, this gentleman won't speak to Claude either. So, that is the point, is that we were a team. So it wasn't about, well, I as the development officer failed. It was, we as a team need to go back and refigure this out. So that's myth 4, all about expectations. I would argue maybe some people might want to take these that miss their expectations in at the next time you have a conversation where you're going to be hired. Go through those questions. So myth 5, a development officer's life is all about eating and drinking, right? That's what everybody thinks. And natural tension within the organization, right? I mean, people at Clemson go, well, those development officers are always dressed up, they always have nice bags or shoes, and they're always going to parties, and you know, what they don't understand is, one is that we might not even want to be there that night, that we look so happy all the time because that's our job to be excited. You know, I say I put on a uniform every day of being excited. That's my uniform in my work. And I think what tends to happen is people see this, and when they come to actually do the job, they find out it's really hard. It's really hard. You know, I joke, there are some mornings I start with a breakfast at 7 a.m. and I get to the office by 8:30, and I am in back-to-back meetings, literally back-to-back till 6 o'clock. And then I have to go have dinner with a donor, and then I get home at 9 o'clock at night. I am not excited all day long, but I have to be excited all day long. That's hard work. I think there's this natural tension needs to be addressed, and I think that's a job of a CEO or an executive director. You know, I think one is Claude did an excellent job about talking about fundraising all the time. He talked about fundraising throughout all of our faculty and our department chairs. He talked about asks he went on. He talked about gifts he gave. He talked about the fact that 50% of his calendar was focused on fundraising, right? Because at the end of the day, the better he did that, the more funding we had in the college, which means the better work our program people, our faculty could do every day. Oh yeah.
Could you just go on about that just a little bit? Because isn't it true that all faculty and staff kind of distrust fundraising?
You know, I think that's very true. And I think it's probably because somebody came before us, stole their donor, right? They probably for 20 years been engaging with some person, building the relationship, and when that person gets successful, what does the development office do? We come riding in going, oh, that's our person. You can't talk to them. I agree. I think that's true of program staff. Like sometimes program people feel the same way in organizations. I think what you have to do is you have to prove yourself to that faculty or staff person, and then they come along. So we have an institute at Clemson where the faculty member chair had a horrible experience at Brown, and he would not talk to development. And I have spent 2-3 years now building a relationship to get inside and help him because he has huge donors. I mean, he has people who give $100 million to organizations. So I think it's about they have to see you're a real person and you're not going to take away their donor.
How did Claude have the time to do so much fundraising and go on when curriculum is really...
He had a really good number 2 in the college who managed the budget and was a dotted line for all the department chairs. So Claude set the model where this person, which I would imagine an organization would maybe be more like an office manager or chief of staff who managed the operation. Claude came in for the big issues, but he set the organization so that he could be out with people. And I will tell you, it was a part of our agreement before I came to Clemson that he would give me 50% of his calendar. That was a negotiation I had in this conversation.
50% of his calendar?
50% of his calendar. Did I ever really take 50? No. But that perception, I went into that job with him thinking I was going to take 50% of his calendar. So I think one is we got to do this, you know, we got to have this conversation within our organizations about fundraising. The other thing is I think we need to talk about everybody's a fundraiser. That's what I tell people all the time. Is the receptionist at the front desk, everyone is a fundraiser because you interact with people. And Claude did a good job of getting other people involved in the process, introducing donors. You know, there's a study, and I don't remember who did this study, but they studied individuals who had given $1 million plus gifts to institutions across this country, and what they found was, on average, those individuals had 7 significant relationships within the organization. Wow. And so sometimes I actually think, you know, we live in the world of metrics in the development world. My development officers have to have so many visits and so many asks and raise so much money. And I sometimes wish I could add a metric of how many key relationships have you created for this donor? Because we're going to be gone. I'm going to leave. And hopefully all my donors have really good relationships with the program people. So I think that this is a place where there's a lot of opportunity for making an organization better. All right, Miss Six. Does anybody remember this movie? What's this movie? 9 to 5. 9 to 5. Dolly Parton's a personal favorite of mine. But I think it's 9 to 5. If a development officer thinks this job is going to be 9 to 5, they're probably not in the right job, right? I mean, I think that's a really key conversation point, and it's a myth. If you think you're going to be able to be successful in fundraising and work from 8 to 5, you're not. Because our donors aren't 9 to 5, right? I mean, I always tell the story. I have one of my favorite couples at Clemson. I will continue to be friends with them after I leave Clemson, because you know, you have some of those. You find those people that just connect in your life personally. Well, their son coming to Clemson was this great story about, I think, 9 to 5, because when I first started talking to them about their son's acceptance to Clemson, it was about a year before he graduated, and they said, well, if he's not accepted, we're done. It's over. If he gets a denial letter, and I knew, we had 19,000 applications for 3,000 spots last year. It's a formula. So I could go on and on. I'm an editorial on that, but I will save that. But good kids, if they don't meet the metrics, don't get an acceptance to Clemson. And when I got in and dug into this kid's SATs and GPA, I knew we were going to have a denial. So I spent a year working this family. Found a program that would accept the family, would accept students outside. You had to actually be denied admission to Clemson to be accepted into the program. So we started down this path. I'll never forget, Valentine's Day. I'm out with my then boyfriend, now fiance, and got a call. And I said, Keith, I got to take this call. It's the Davies. They're just on, pins and needles about this getting denied. Will he get denied? We need to get him denied. Remember, this couple that said if he gets denied, we're done. Now they're asking for the denial. I thought that was hilarious. So I call them. I'm on the phone. They're obviously in the car on their way to their Valentine's dinner, and we spent about 20 minutes talking to them. All I'm doing is talking them off like the roof, right? That's all I'm doing. So the next day, because letters come out around February 14th at Clemson, so my phone tends to get real busy that time of year. And so the next day, phone rings, and it's the husband. He's whispering. He's like, Missy, Kelly needs you to call right now. She's in the house. She doesn't know I'm out here, but she is freaking out that he is not going to get a denial. So I get on the phone and I call. Again, it's a Saturday, folks. It's a Saturday. So I call him. And I can't tell you how much time I spent with that family holding their hand, right? That's all I did. Because you can't really buy your way into Clemson, I gotta be honest. It's hard. I mean, your kids have to make some type of, get into this early success program or go somewhere else for a year and transfer to Clemson. But I held their hand through it, and I probably, when it was all said and done, spent, and I kid you not, 80 hours on the phone with them over that time period. And none of those times were really between 9 to 5. I mean, it was after hours work, because our donors do their volunteer work, have their concerns outside of work hours. But the reality is I love what I do. I can't believe I get to wake up every day and essentially talk about great programs and be friends with people. So I will do it over and over, and the people I work with are amazing. And so I would gladly talk to them at 8 o'clock at night. So I think that this whole idea of 9 to 5 is something that needs to be talked about with development officers and CEOs, expectations. And I would also argue that you're going to spend a lot of time with your CEO or executive if you're doing things right. So you kind of got to like that person. I really like Claude Lilly. Yes, he drives me crazy. And he will tell you, yes, she drives me crazy. But I really like him. I really like what he does. And I was happy even to go to Alligator Alley and listen to a book on tape for 3 hours. So, Miss 7, and we're almost to the end, is, what's this phrase? Show me the money. Isn't that what our volunteers and board members tell us all the time? Show me the money. And it's even what we do at the university setting. I mean, I think it's all about the money. And I think that this is a real conversation. I have actually just moved our development evaluations away from so much on the money. The money is an end result of good work done right. So at Clemson, we have all these metrics, but what we were really doing was measuring development officers based on the amount of money they raised. And here's what I know. If a development officer does the visits right and the ask right, the money will come. And so 30% of our evaluation is now about your visits. Do your contact reports come in time? Do they have the right information? Are they significant? Are you getting them in within 72 hours of the visit? So we really focus on that conversation about how our visits going, what's being accomplished, are we being strategic? The next one is about asks. Are you making the ask? I find there are constant cultivators out there. Our job is to ask, and I believe our job is to ask big. I always ask big. The only time in my life I was asked somebody for $25,000 and they said, no, I think we're going to do 100. That's the only time it's ever happened. But that's the reality, is no one's ever going to say, no, I think I'll do double what you asked me. I would rather them stretch them and them come down. So I think we really need to focus on the visits. We need to be proud to be making the ask. If you don't like to make the ask, you're probably not in the right business, because you're going to really struggle in this job. And then the last part needs to be about the dollars that come in the door. Because if we've done those two things right, the money will come. And I think we're kind of obsessed with the dollar portion of this and not obsessed with the right things, which is the relationship. Are we really listening to the donor? Are we really moving them along? Are we engaging them in the conversation? Are we being donor-centered? Are we being honest with them? You know, that's what really needs to happen. I think the thing we're getting away from a little bit in the world is all these metrics. And metrics are simply there to help you manage people. It's not meant to be the dictator of how we raise money. That's all it's meant to do, is help you figure out where you have a problem and help manage to that staff person. So, our conclusions, here are our truths, right? We've spent 7 myths, and the number 1 is unique relationships take work. They do that, they take work. 2 is a DO means more work for a CEO, not less. Number 3, the CEO is the Chief Development Officer. 4, expectations. I think we need to have expectations of our CEO that are within check, and they need to have expectations that are within check of us. 5 is development is a whole lot more than eating and drinking, although the pounds on the scale sometimes tell you differently. 6 is no 9 to 5 here. This is not a 9 to 5 job. You gotta think about that. And there's a lot more to fundraising than just the money. So, I don't claim to be an expert in this. These are just ahas I have learned along the way with Claude Lilly, who I owe a lot of my career to, and being a great executive CEO for me. So, any questions?
I don't know where to start.
I hope that's good.
You know, we just need to force feed all of this. It's so good to so many people. Is it not true that when we don't have the chance to set up this kind of relationship with a CEO, and we come in and we find ourselves in a situation that maybe doesn't quite measure up to this, that a lot of the magic to this is figuring out what the CEO will do and then filling in the holes up to that. I mean, I've had them that were so anti-fundraising that it was literally, will you go to lunch and accept the check? You know, and that's all they did.
Yeah.
But I mean, we have to, most of the time, figure all of this out in relation to our CEO and the deans and the staff, all while we're talking about let's all be fundraisers. But understand, in terms of expectations, that most of the time it's going to be figuring out how to approximate this in our own situation.
I think, and the other side of this is, I think if we don't have this conversation, we're actually doing a disservice to our colleagues and to our future development officers, right? If we start demanding this conversation before we're hired, people will people behave the way you measure or to what they want. So if we start as an industry having these conversations prior to coming on board, we're going to start changing the culture. Like, I think it's our job. If we're waiting for CEOs and board members to change, they have no reason to. We have to push the dialogue. We have to push the conversation. And gosh, what can we do for our legacy of development officers if we have kind of started to shift knowledge away from, you're going to be the fundraiser and I'm not going to have to do anything. We're about to do a lot more work. So.
Earlier you mentioned volunteers, and you gave an example in which you had this esteemed professor or individual as part of, I believe, a board. With regards to other volunteers, do you utilize them in a development role? Not necessarily to make an ask, but...
Everything.
Great.
And I'm very different. Like, university development officers tend to kind of focus on their own, like, I'm the university development officer, this is my job. I can tell you, so I have a donor right now who is unhappy with the current leadership in our organization within the College of Business. She was ready to make a $1.5 million gift before the interim was named. She is so frustrated, particularly because he can't seem to get her name right. I can understand that. Right? So it's not working right now with the administrator. But I don't want to lose a $1.5 million gift for Clemson University for a building we need to have. And so what did I do? I took a volunteer and I told him exactly what the problem was. It was a volunteer that she respected and admired and looked up to. And he walked in that door. We sat at dinner. He was beautiful at it. He took her all the way to the end, to where at the end of the dinner she said, Mark, what do I need to do? How do we get this done? And so I think a lot of times, I call it, it's like a big game of chess, right? I'm looking at this chessboard and I'm trying to figure out how to move the person. And so what influences are going to move the person over the line? And that's all, I mean, that to me is very fun, like, right? And if you tell me no, I look at that as even more of a challenge. But it's like this big game of chess. And we got to figure out what the barriers are and figure out who can help us move those barriers. And a lot of times, when we have challenges in the university on leadership, we can turn to our volunteers and they can, you know, move the needle for us.
Thank you.
Anything else? No?
What is your
Let's
issue on
give-
confidentiality in that case?
You sign an agreement, ironclad agreement that we have with the general counsel came up. We have our volunteers sign an agreement, and then they're under, we sign it every year too. So we remind our volunteers that you have access to very confidential information and we need you to, and like my emails, I'm not always the best at it, but really should start with confidential information, you know, in that, so.
Let's give Missy a round of applause. Email address. We're now emailing you evaluation for you all to get CFRE credit for these. So please fill out the evaluation. If you want to be a speaker, if you have some ideas for speakers, let us know. If you want CFRE credit, just email me and I'll make sure you get a receipt, and Missy wants to make a comment.
And two things, so I have to just say about AFP, I mean, since I haven't captured audience. Number one is we are in a very, very critical time right now with legislation both nationally and locally, because I think what happens at the national level is going to impact us at the local level, and the world is watching us, right? We are the leaders in philanthropy. So I encourage you, if ever there was a time, support AFP's PAC. Make a gift. It does not matter how big that gift is, but we need to have the resources to be able to influence and support the candidates who support philanthropy. So that's number one, and I think all of us, I mean, it's happening, folks. They're getting ready to cap charitable deductions, and that is going to change our world. Doesn't mean we can't change in the future, but I think supporting our PAC is really critical. And the other thing is the AFP Foundation for Philanthropy. I know all of you probably felt like me, like we pay our membership dues. I feel like I'm not getting enough. Now, why do I have to give to the Foundation on Philanthropy? I'm not asking you to give a huge gift, but please go and give a gift to the AFP Foundation on Philanthropy. That foundation funds so many things to begin to make change in philanthropy as a whole. And it's hard when you're a membership organization to then show up and ask for a gift, right, for our foundation, but there are a lot of great things we're doing and change we're making in this country through that foundation and what we're able to fund. And so, you know, if today I could ask you to do one thing, go back, make a small gift to the PAC, and make a small gift to the foundation to support the work we're doing. So,
Thanks, Missy. Missy has cards and she'd be glad to talk to you and one-on-one answer your questions that you have. Thanks for being here. We'll see you the third Wednesday of May from Myra Grant, and all about how to make a gift acceptance policy.
It's really not. It was like